A dedicated nurse is accused of treason by a ruthless drug lord and discovers that her father, a legendary gangster, hid a dark past to protect her. But when the truth comes to light, she faces a decision that could change everything or destroy her forever. Isabella wiped her shaking hands with a damp cloth as she watched a young man with a makeshift bandage on his arm. The community clinic, a refuge for those who couldn't afford a hospital, was busier than ever. Outside, the city was eerily silent, broken only by the distant echo of sirens and occasional gunshots. Isabella had learned to move in the shadows, but tonight, the sense of danger was even more intense. Back at her modest home, Isabella took a deep breath before opening the door. Her home was small, but there she found the peace she longed for after exhausting days at the clinic. She turned on a lamp and dropped her bag on the table when a subtle sound, a creaking on the floor, alerted her. Before she could react, the back door was violently opened. 3 armed men burst into her living room. "Where is the information?" one demanded, his voice booming like thunder. Isabella stepped back, fear paralyzing her legs. "Information? I don't know what they're talking about," he muttered, trying to remain calm. "Don't act innocent," another man said, raising his gun. "Alejandro wants answers. You betrayed him." The name Alejandro hit her like a hammer. She knew that name. Everyone in the city knew it. Alejandro was the ruthless leader of one of the most feared cartels in the region. But why was she accused of treason? She had nothing to do with him or his world. "I don't know anything," Isabella cried, her heart pounding. One of the men stepped forward, grabbing her arm tightly. The intent in his eyes was clear. They weren't going to let her leave alive. However, a flash of survival lit up in Isabella. In one swift movement, she managed to free herself and run toward the front door. Adrenaline was driving her, and she barely managed to dodge the gunshots that tore through the air behind her. He ran without looking back, his feet pounding on the wet pavement as the sound of his pursuers faded into the distance. When he finally stopped in a dark alley, he leaned against a wall, trying to catch his breath. The men's words echoed in his mind. Alejandro wants answers. That night, while the city seemed to be asleep, a new order was given from the shadows. Alexander, furious at the knowledge that Isabella had escaped, spoke firmly to his men. "Find her. If she is a traitor, she will pay with her life." Translated from Spanish to English, www.onlinedrnslater.com. Hidden in the darkness, Isabella knew that her life had just changed forever. Her quiet world had been transformed into a battlefield, and although she didn't understand the reasons, she knew that her only option was to flee. Taking refuge in Carmen's house, Isabella could barely breathe from the pressure on her chest. Her friend, always faithful, had welcomed her without asking any questions, although her face reflected the concern they both felt. "What happened, Isabella? Why are you like this?" Carmen asked as she carefully closed the curtains in the living room. Isabella didn't know where to begin. Her mind kept replaying images of the armed men, the threats, and the name that kept resonating: Alejandro. Finally, between broken sighs, she told everything to Carmen, who listened in silence. When Isabella mentioned Alejandro and the name Don Rafael, Carmen's expression changed. "Don Rafael?" Carmen asked, avoiding her friend's gaze. "I heard it from one of them," Isabella replied. "I don't know who it is, but I'm sure it has something to do with all this." Carmen pressed her lips together, hesitant. "Isabella, you never talked to your mother about your father?" The question came as a shock. Isabella remembered her mother as a strong woman, but always evasive about the past. As a child, she had asked many times about her father, but her mother only responded with vague phrases like, "He's not someone you need to worry about." "What do you know, Carmen?" insisted Isabella, approaching with her heart beating faster. "I know. Very little. But I know that name, Don Rafael, was linked to your family in some way." Isabella felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. Everything she thought she knew about her life now seemed like a lie. "Why didn't you ever tell me anything?" he asked in a tone that was a mixture of rage and helplessness. "Because I didn't want to butt in where I didn't belong, Isabella. I thought it best not to stir up trouble." Isabella looked away, her mind racing. "I need answers," she said firmly. "I can't stay here hiding while those people hunt me down." "And what do you plan to do?" Carmen asked, alarmed. "Find the truth. And if Alejandro has something to do with this, I need to face that too." Carmen approached, taking her friend's hands. "Be careful, Isabella. There are things from the past that are better left uncovered." But for Isabella, the past was no longer just a distant echo. It had now become a tangible threat. That night, as Carmen slept, Isabella went over and over the name Don Rafael. Something inside her told her that everything revolved around this man, a stranger who, in some way, seemed to be tied to her destiny. Meanwhile, Alejandro, with a glass of whiskey in his hand, looked out the window of his mansion. "Don Rafael," he murmured, as if the name was a shadow that had been following him for years. A mixture of anger and curiosity crossed his face. If Isabella was related to him, that changed everything. The search would intensify, and both Isabella and Alejandro were about to discover that the shadows of the past always find a way to come to light. The first light of dawn filtered through the windows as Isabella hurried through the deserted streets. She had left Carmen's house before her friend woke up, determined to find answers. Every step she took seemed to take her further away from the quiet life she once had. Her destination was a small church on the outskirts of town, a place her mother often mentioned in vague conversations about her past. Arriving there, Isabella pushed open the solid wooden door, feeling the cold, dense air in the room. An older man in a worn cassock looked up from the altar. "Father Manuel," Isabella whispered, recognizing him from her mother's descriptions. The priest watched her curiously, though his face soon turned gloomy upon hearing the name of Isabella's mother. "Your mother, a strong woman, but with many secrets," he said, inviting her to sit on a nearby bench. In a halting voice, Isabella explained the reason for her visit. Armed men, Alejandro's name, and above all, the mention of Don Rafael. Upon hearing that last name, the priest closed his eyes as if an old wound had reopened. "Don Rafael is not just any name, Isabella," he began, staring at the cross in front of them. "He was a feared and respected man, a legendary gangster in this region decades ago." Isabella's heart stopped for a moment. "Are you saying that my father was a criminal?" The priest sighed deeply. "He was, but one day he disappeared. No one knows exactly why. Some say he wanted to protect his family, others that he ran away to save his life." Isabella clenched her hands tightly, trying to process what she had just heard. All her life she had lived in the shadow of a man whose existence she had completely ignored. "And what does Alejandro have to do with me?" he asked desperately. "Alejandro, he leads the cartel that Don Rafael betrayed before disappearing. If they know who you are, they probably think you may have information that is worth gold to them." Panic began to set in for Isabella. If her relationship with Don Rafael had come to light, that meant she was no longer just a nurse caught in a conflict. She was a target in the middle of a war. Meanwhile, in another corner of the city, Alejandro was in his office, surrounded by his most loyal men. On his desk was an old file with photos and documents. Looking at a worn photograph of Don Rafael, Alejandro frowned. "So the girl is related to you," he murmured, his fingers drumming on the wood. One of his men spoke. "What do we do, boss?" Alejandro looked up, his eyes shining with determination. "We are intensifying the search. If she is related to Don Rafael, I want answers. And if she is a threat, we will not hesitate." Back at the church, Isabella thanked the priest before leaving with her heart full of questions. The air seemed heavier, and every shadow in the streets reminded her that she was being hunted. Yet deep within her, something began to burn. A mixture of fear and determination. If Don Rafael had risked everything to protect her, then he was not going to give up without fighting for the truth. Night was falling over the city, enveloping the streets in a blanket of shadows. Isabella had spent the last few hours moving from place to place, trying to stay hidden, but her luck ran out in an instant. As she walked down a narrow alley, a black car abruptly stopped in front of her. Before she could react, two men got out and held her tightly. "Let me go!" she screamed, kicking uselessly as she was pushed into the vehicle. Her heart was racing. Her entire body was shaking, but her mind was desperately trying to find a way out. The ride was short, and when the vehicle stopped, the men dragged her into a dark, seemingly abandoned building. As she entered, the bright lights of a makeshift lounge blinded her for a moment. In the center of the room, sitting in a leather chair, was Alejandro. His presence was imposing. Tall, with a cold, calculating gaze, he radiated an authority that left no room for doubt. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine as her captors pushed her to the floor in front of him. "So this is the famous Isabella," Alejandro said, his voice calm but loaded with danger. "Do you know how much you have complicated my life?" Isabella raised her head with difficulty, trying to control the fear that gripped her. "I don't know what you're accusing me of. I have nothing to do with you or your world." Alejandro let out a dry laugh. "That would be more credible if you didn't have the surname Don Rafael in your veins." The impact of those words left Isabella breathless. How did he know about her father? And more importantly, what was their relationship? "I don't understand what my father has to do with you," he said bravely, although his voice trembled slightly. Alejandro leaned forward, his eyes piercing her like daggers. "Your father was more than just a gangster. He was a man who changed everything, for better and for worse. He saved my life, but he also betrayed our people. And now here you are, his legacy." Isabella felt her world falling apart. She had expected answers, but not like this. And certainly not in front of a man who could decide her fate with a simple gesture. "I have nothing to do with him. I barely knew him," she replied, her tone firmer. "I just want to understand why you are after me." Alejandro stood up, slowly walking around her like a predator assessing its prey. "Maybe you're telling the truth, or maybe you're not. But until I find out, you're not going anywhere." Isabella looked at him with anger and determination. "And what will you gain by keeping me? If you know so much about my father, then you know that he left to protect us." Alejandro stopped suddenly, his eyes reflecting a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "Protect them," he repeated, almost in a whisper. The atmosphere became more tense, as if the two were playing a dangerous game of chess. Alejandro knew that Isabella was more valuable alive than dead, but he still didn't fully understand how she fit into the story Don Rafael had left behind. "For now, Isabella, you will live. But be careful if I discover that you know more than you let on." His threat hung in the air, as sharp as a knife. Alejandro's men led her into a small locked room. As Isabella sat on the worn mattress, her mind was on fire. She had discovered something about her father, but the pieces didn't fit. Now she was trapped, and her only way out seemed to depend on a man who had no scruples. The room where Isabella was being held was small and devoid of any comfort. The concrete walls seemed to absorb the cold of the night, and a flickering light bulb barely illuminated the space. Sitting on the threadbare mattress, she mentally reviewed every word Alejandro had said. The figure of her father, until then a distant specter, now seemed to be at the center of everything. The door swung open, and Alexander entered, accompanied by one of his men. The latter left a tray of water and a piece of bread on the floor before leaving. Alexander stood with his arms crossed, watching her in silence. Isabella did not look away. She knew that showing fear would only give her an advantage. "Let's talk," he finally said, breaking the silence. He sat down in a chair across from her. "There's something you need to know." Isabella remained silent, but her entire body was tense, waiting for the inevitable. "Your father, Don Rafael, was not just a powerful man," Alejandro began. "He was a brilliant strategist, someone who understood the game better than anyone. For years, he worked with me and other cartel leaders, building an empire." Alejandro paused, as if the words that followed were more difficult to pronounce. "But then one day, he betrayed us. He disappeared with valuable information and resources that belonged to the cartel. Because of him, many of our people died." Isabella felt a knot in her stomach. It was hard to imagine that her father, someone she had idealized in his absence, could have caused so much harm. "Why did he do it?" he asked quietly, although the answer terrified him. Alejandro stared at her, evaluating whether her question was genuine. "According to some, he did it for you, his family, but others think he simply wanted to save himself." Anger and confusion mingled in Isabella's heart. Her mind struggled to reconcile the image of a man who had abandoned her with that of a legendary criminal. "And you, what do you think?" he asked defiantly. Alejandro laughed. but there was no humor in his laughter. "I think your father was a complicated man. He saved my life once, and for that I owed him my loyalty. But then he sold us out. So tell me, Isabella, whose side are you on?" The question took her by surprise. "I'm not on anyone's side," she replied firmly. "I didn't ask to be born into this situation, and I have nothing to do with the decisions he made." Alejandro tilted his head as if considering her words. "You're brave, I admit, but that doesn't change the fact that you're now in the middle of something you don't understand." Isabella took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "If Don Rafael saved your life, then you owe him something too. And if all of this has to do with him, I propose that we work together to uncover the truth." Alejandro frowned. He wasn't used to someone confronting him like that, much less someone in his position. "Are you suggesting a truce?" he asked incredulously. "That's exactly what I'm suggesting," Isabella replied, keeping her gaze steady. "If you find my father, you might get the answers you seek, and so will I." Silence filled the room as Alejandro considered her proposal. Finally, he stood up. "You're smarter than I thought, but I don't trust you. If you try anything, you'll pay the consequences." Without another word, he left the room, leaving Isabella alone with her thoughts. Although her heart was filled with doubt and pain from the revelations about her father, she had managed to buy herself some time. Now the next step was to find out if his proposal would be enough to keep her alive. The atmosphere was tense as Isabella and Alejandro met again, this time in a larger room within the same building. Maps and documents were spread out on a makeshift table, evidence that Alejandro had not ceased his fight against a rival cartel that he said represented a common threat. Isabella watched silently as Alejandro spoke to his men, his firm, authoritative voice echoing through the space. "They control the border and are closing our routes. If we don't act now, we will lose more ground," said Alejandro, pointing to a strategic point on the map. Isabella took advantage of a moment of silence to intervene. "If the problem is so serious, maybe you should focus on solving it instead of wasting time chasing me." Alejandro looked at her, surprised by her boldness. But after a few seconds, a lopsided smile appeared on his face. "Maybe you're right, Isabella, but as I said before, I don't trust you." "Then test me," she replied firmly, moving toward the table. "If you want answers about my father, you'll have to trust that I'm as interested in finding out the truth as you are." The room fell silent. Alejandro exchanged glances with his men, as if weighing Isabella's words. Finally, he made a decision. "Very well. There is something you could do to prove your loyalty," he said, pointing at the map. "The rival cartel has a base near the river. I need someone to go in and get information on their next operation." Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. She had no experience in such situations, but she understood that rejecting Alejandro's proposal meant signing her death sentence. "I will," he said, trying to hide the tremble in his voice. "You will not go alone," Alejandro interrupted. "One of my men will accompany you. And remember, any mistake will cost us dearly." Hours later, Isabella and a man named Mateo, one of Alejandro's lieutenants, infiltrated the enemy camp. Adrenaline coursed through their veins as they moved through the shadows, dodging guards and searching for documents that might be useful. Mateo, though initially wary of working with her, came to admire her determination. "I didn't expect you to be so brave," he murmured as they looked through a file. "I have no choice," Isabella replied in a whisper. "If this brings me closer to answers about my father, I will do whatever it takes." They returned at dawn, exhausted but with key information about a shipment of weapons that the rival cartel planned to intercept. Alejandro greeted them with a mix of relief and distrust, reviewing the documents they brought. "You did a good job," he finally admitted, turning to Isabella. "Maybe you're not as useless as I thought." "Don't be mistaken, Alejandro," she replied coldly. "This isn't about you. It's about me." Over the next few days, Isabella and Alejandro's relationship began to transform. Though tension remained, the two found common ground in their search for the truth. Isabella discovered that behind the facade of a cruel leader, Alejandro had a human side, one that only revealed itself in moments of vulnerability. For his part, Alejandro began to see in Isabella not only a determined woman, but also someone with a strength he never expected to find. In the midst of their forced alliance, new clues emerged. An old contact of Alejandro's confirmed a rumor they had both begun to suspect. Don Rafael was alive. The news struck like a bolt from the blue. While Alejandro saw the opportunity to settle accounts, Isabella felt a mixture of hope and fear. If her father was alive, what would that mean for her? And more importantly, could she face the man who had defined her destiny without even being present in her life? The ambush came out of nowhere. Isabella and Alejandro had barely begun to consider their next move when gunshots rang out in the air. The small house where they were hiding was filled with chaos as Alejandro's men tried to repel the attack. Bullets pierced windows and walls, and the roar was deafening. Isabella, huddled behind an overturned couch, looked at Alejandro, who was returning fire with calculated precision. "We have to get out of here," she screamed, her voice shaking with panic. "Not without those documents," Alejandro replied, pointing to a briefcase on the table. The attack was relentless. Isabella thought it would be the end of her, when suddenly the gunfire stopped. A tense silence filled the space, and then firm footsteps were heard approaching. Alejandro raised his gun, ready to fire, but before he could, the front door burst open. There he was, Don Rafael. He was a man of imposing figure, with graying hair and a face marked by scars and years of hard living. He wore simple clothes, but his presence was undeniable, as if everything around him stopped to recognize him. His gaze met Isabella's, and something in his dark eyes made her shudder. It was her father. There was no mistaking it. "Lower your weapons," Don Rafael ordered Alejandro's men, who, to Isabella's surprise, obeyed immediately. Alejandro, bewildered, looked at him with a mixture of anger and respect. "Rafael, I thought you were dead." "I was, for all intents and purposes," Don Rafael replied in a grave voice. "But I couldn't stay hidden while my daughter was in danger." Isabella stood up slowly, her legs shaking. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why did you disappear?" Don Rafael sighed deeply, as if the weight of the years fell upon him at that moment. "I did it to protect you, Isabella. My life was stained with blood, and I knew that if I stayed close, you and your mother would suffer the consequences." "Protect me?" she exclaimed, taking a step towards him. "Do you know what it's like to grow up without a father? Without answers?" Don Rafael lowered his gaze, unable to bear the intensity of his daughter's emotions. Alejandro, observing the scene, crossed his arms, his expression hardened. "Rafael, you haven't changed. You always justify your actions, but you never accept the consequences." Don Rafael looked at him calmly. "I know I made mistakes, Alejandro, but so did you. Why are you going after my daughter when you know she has nothing to do with my past?" Alejandro remained silent, not knowing how to respond. The tension in the room was palpable. Finally, Don Rafael turned to Isabella again. "I know I failed you, daughter, but I'm here now, and I'll do everything I can to make it right." Isabella didn't know how to feel. For years, she had idealized her father as an absent hero, but now before him, she saw an imperfect man, full of contradictions. "This doesn't fix anything," he said, his voice thick with pain. "But I want the truth, the whole truth." Don Rafael nodded. "You will, but first, we must survive this." As he spoke, noises could be heard outside. The rival cartel was reorganizing to launch a second attack. Don Rafael took command with an ease that demonstrated his experience. He gave precise orders to Alejandro's men, who reluctantly accepted him as temporary leader. "Isabella, stay close to me," he told her, with an authority that left no room for discussion. The battle that followed was intense. Don Rafael demonstrated why he was a legend, moving with deadly precision and ensuring that Isabella was protected at all times. Alejandro, though reluctant, recognized his skill and joined him, forming a united front against the common enemy. As the last shot rang out and silence returned, Isabella collapsed to the ground, exhausted. Her father and Alejandro approached, both covered in dust and blood. "This is not over," said Don Rafael, looking at both of them. "If we want to survive, we must act together." Isabella stared at him, her mind filled with questions and conflicting emotions. Their reunion had been a whirlwind, but one thing was clear. The answers she sought were closer than ever. The tranquility after the ambush was illusory. Isabella, Alejandro, and Don Rafael were in a small room, lit by a single lamp hanging from the ceiling. The atmosphere was charged with tension, each one absorbed in their own thoughts. On the table, a map marked the positions of the rival cartel, while Rafael drew lines with a red marker. "We don't have much time," Don Rafael said in a firm voice without taking his eyes off the map. "If we want to finish this, we must strike quickly and accurately." Isabella watched him from the corner, trying to decipher the man now in front of her. Her father was not just a gangster, he was a strategist, someone used to manipulating and controlling extreme situations. His every move seemed calculated. "What do you propose?" Alejandro asked, his arms crossed. Although his respect for Rafael was evident, he still eyed him with suspicion. Rafael looked up and pointed to a warehouse marked on the map. "This is their headquarters. They store weapons, drugs, and everything they need to maintain control there. If we manage to destroy it, they will lose enough strength to be unable to fight back." "It's suicidal," Alexander replied, frowning. "They are better armed and have more men." "I know," Rafael replied with a slight smile, "but I have a plan." Isabella, who had remained silent, took a step toward the table. "And what is that plan?" he asked with a mixture of curiosity and distrust. Rafael looked directly at her, his expression softer. "We will use chaos against them. They expect us to attack in force, but they will not be prepared for a quick infiltration. Isabella, I need you to be the key." "Me?" she asked, surprised. "I have no experience in this." "That's exactly why," Rafael replied. "They won't see you as a threat. Your role will be to distract them while Alejandro and I plant the explosives." Alejandro snorted, showing his disagreement. "Are you crazy? I'm not going to risk her like that." "There is no other option," Rafael replied firmly. "If we want to win, we need to use all available resources." Isabella felt the gazes of both men falling on her. Her heart was pounding, but she knew she couldn't turn back. "I'll do it," she said finally, with more courage than she actually felt. "If this brings us closer to the end, I'm willing." Rafael nodded, satisfied, while Alejandro pursed his lips, clearly annoyed but not putting up any further fight. The next night, the plan went into action. Isabella approached the warehouse with a calm demeanor, pretending to be a lost woman looking for help. The guards, baffled, let their guard down upon seeing her. Meanwhile, Alejandro and Rafael moved through the shadows carrying backpacks with explosives towards key points in the building. Isabella did her best to keep the guards' attention, making up a story about being stranded nearby. However, time was running out. One of the men became suspicious and pulled out his gun. "Who are you, really?" he asked harshly, advancing towards her. At that moment, an explosion rang out inside the warehouse, followed by another. Chaos broke out. The guards ran into the burning building, allowing Isabella to escape and rejoin Alejandro and Rafael at a safe point. "We did it," Rafael said, watching the smoke rising in the distance. "For now," Alejandro replied, his expression grim. "This is not over." Isabella looked at them both, feeling a mix of relief and fear. The plan had been a success, but she knew this was only the beginning of the end. From the shadows, Rafael approached her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm proud of you, daughter," he said softly. Isabella didn't answer. Although her father's words meant a lot, there was still a distance between them, a wound that would not be easy to heal. In the back of her mind, she knew that the next few hours would be crucial. What had started as a search for answers had now become a fight to survive and redefine who she really was. The destroyed warehouse was just the first step. The operation had weakened the rival cartel, but had not eliminated it completely. That same night, Rafael, Alejandro, and Isabella met in a makeshift hideout. The atmosphere was tense. Shadows danced on the walls while a swinging lamp illuminated the map on the table. "They won't sit still," Alexander said gravely. "They'll come for us, and they'll do it with everything they've got." "I know," Rafael replied with a calm that disconcerted Isabella. "That's why we have to end this now." "A direct attack?" Alejandro asked, frowning. "Exactly. But it will be different this time. We are not going to destroy a warehouse. We are going after their leader. If we cut off the snake's head, the rest will fall." Isabella listened in silence, feeling a knot in her stomach. Her father's words were clear, but the risk was enormous. Finally, she dared to speak. "And what is the plan?" Raphael looked at her, his expression more serious than ever. "You won't be in this one." "What?" Isabella protested, taking a step toward him. "I've come this far, and now you're telling me to stay outside." "This is not negotiable, daughter," Raphael said, his voice firm. "You have already risked too much. This is my problem, my legacy." Isabella felt rage burning inside her, but before she could respond, Alejandro intervened. "Raphael is right. This is not something you should get involved in." "You can't decide for me," Isabella replied, her eyes full of determination. "This is my life too." "Then someone has to stop it," Isabella said firmly. Alejandro looked at her, surprised. "Are you saying you're going to stay?" "Not just stay," she replied, turning to him. "I want to use my father's resources, everything he left behind, to rebuild this city, but not the way he did it. I want to do something different, something that honors his sacrifice." Alejandro watched her in silence for a moment, assessing her resolve. Finally, a small smile appeared on his lips. "You're more like Raphael than you think." "I don't want to be like him," Isabella said firmly. "I want to learn from his mistakes." Alejandro looked away toward the city, as if he were considering something important. "I'm tired of this too, tired of the blood, of the betrayals, of always living waiting for the next blow." "So why don't you do something about it?" Isabella asked, a mix of defiance and hope in her voice. "Because I never thought I'd have a choice," he replied, almost in a whisper. "But maybe now I do." The next night, the plan went into action. Isabella approached the warehouse with a calm demeanor, pretending to be a lost woman looking for help. The guards, baffled, let their guard down upon seeing her. Meanwhile, Alejandro and Raphael moved through the shadows carrying backpacks with explosives towards key points in the building. Isabella did her best to keep the guards' attention, making up a story about being stranded nearby. However, time was running out. One of the men became suspicious and pulled out his gun. "Who are you, really?" he asked harshly, advancing towards her. At that moment, an explosion rang out inside the warehouse, followed by another. Chaos broke out. The guards ran into the burning building, allowing Isabella to escape and rejoin Alejandro and Raphael at a safe point. Time passed, and together they began to work on their vision of a new beginning. Alejandro, inspired by Raphael's sacrifice and Isabella's determination, decided to abandon crime. He used his influence to disband what was left of his organization, offering his men a choice: work on rebuilding the city or leave for good. Isabella, for her part, contacted local communities, presenting herself as someone willing to help, not impose. With Raphael's hidden resources, they began to finance projects to improve living conditions in the neighborhoods most affected by violence. Although the initial mistrust was difficult to overcome, little by little they won the support of the people. One day, while going through her father's papers in an old office, Isabella found a letter addressed to her. The handwriting was unmistakable. Raphael had written those words before he disappeared. "Dear Isabella, if you're reading this, it means I've failed to stay out of your life, but I hope not to protect you. Everything I've done out of love, even though I know my actions won't always be easy to forgive. You have the strength I never had, the ability to choose a different path. Do it, daughter. Do it for yourself, for your mother, and for all those who may still have hope." Tears welled up as Isabella read those words. Her father had not only left her a legacy of blood, he had also given her the chance to redeem it. Within a few months, the city began to show signs of change. Once forgotten neighborhoods bustled with activity, and rumors of violence were replaced by stories of collaboration. Though the road was long, Isabella knew she was taking the first steps towards something bigger. One morning, while walking along one of the renovated streets, Alejandro joined her. "See?" he said, pointing to a group of children playing in a newly built square. "This is thanks to you." "It's thanks to all of us," Isabella replied, smiling. Though the pain of loss was still present, Isabella felt something new: hope. And as the sun lit up the city, she silently vowed to never let darkness consume her again. In the end, Isabella's story reminds us that the past may define us, but our choices are what truly transform us. She faced difficult decisions, sacrifices, in painful truths to find a new path. Now the question is, what would you do if you had to bear the weight of a dark legacy? Would you fight to redeem it or let it consume you? Think about it. Click on the video on the screen to follow this exciting story and discover more about how our choices shape our future. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more inspiring content like this. See you in the next video.